Erica, if you can just give me a thumbs up that you can hear me. Okay, good deal. Nice meeting you all this morning. I'm Dave Ribble. For the last 18 or so years, I was with a company called Hillrom, um, global medical device company, and for the last 10 years, I was director of innovation there. And on Monday, I'm actually starting a new gig. I'll be a senior consultant with a management consulting firm, Frost and Sullivan, working with other companies on some of the same subjects I've been working on over the last 18 years in developing medical devices. Um, let's see. Okay, it looks like most people can hear. So I wanted to give you just an overview of how new products are developed. I'm going to come from a background of medical devices. I've worked on projects where we've developed nurse call systems, systems for imaging the back of the retina, hospital beds, surgical tables, operating room tables. But kind of surprisingly, or maybe not, the process for developing a product from going from a concept to something you can hold in your hand is pretty similar across industries. And projects can be much larger, much smaller. They have different specific technologies and needs. But this will hopefully give you an overview of how a big company goes through the process of launching a product out onto the market. So as you can imagine, most products start out with an idea, with somebody who's sketched something on the back of a napkin, or been in a meeting with some colleagues, coming up with an idea on a new product. And at the end of the day, what you have is something that you can hold in your hands and that hopefully does something good for somebody. But I want to just take you through the process of how you go from the one to the other. And just to give you a little background of, the people who are going to go from the one to the other are a variety of team members. And there's a real diversity of people who are involved in developing a new product. Um, the ones that you would probably imagine are engineers. And these can be engineers from, a variety of fields, as you can imagine, depending on the technology. On the kinds of projects I was involved in, you had computer engineers, computer scientists, we had optical engineers, we had engineers in physical sciences. On a couple of projects, we had chemists, a lot of electrical engineers. Just, it depends on the type of company you're at and the type of technology you're working with and the problems that you're trying to solve. But there are actually a lot of other people outside of those traditional engineering roles involved in developing a product. Um, Marketing is one of the actually largest. Uh, these are the members of the team who are, typically involved in understanding customers and their needs. Um, Sourcing is kind of related to engineering. These are the people who go out and find components, and these might be manufactured products, a computer chip that you need to make your device, or they might be very raw sourcing. We need steel, we need copper, we need plastics. And so you've got team members who are working with partners to bring in pieces that you need to build your device. uh, Other groups like quality and regulatory who are making sure that you're building something that will work and work safely. Manufacturing, the people who are actually going to build the device, if you're talking about a physical device, and then the people who are going to support this out in the rest of the world. So now to just take you through the process of developing a new product. Almost any new product development process will basically go through these 5 phases. As I said, they'll be very different when you come to the specifics of the technology, but overall, you can imagine a 5-step process for developing any new product. And Eric has put up a poll just to kind of give you a frame of reference on how long or how short it might take to go from this idea to a product. The people who came up with the idea for the company Uber, and you can think of Uber as a product. It's a complicated product that touches a lot of people, but if you can imagine Uber as the product on your phone that lets you order a ride, the question is, how long did it take these people to go from the idea while they were standing in the rain in Paris, I think it was, that it would be great if I could get a ride on my phone, to them having the first Uber ride. I think it was in San Francisco, somebody able to get on their phone and hail an Uber ride. So you can answer that poll as I continue. But the first step in any new product development process is this first one. It's understanding. And by understanding, we mean understanding what the customer needs and understanding what kind of a solution would meet that need, would solve that customer's problem. It's always interesting when we're talking about this phase of new product development, because a lot of what I and my team and people at this first stage of new product development would be doing doesn't look a lot like work. And it definitely doesn't look like engineering or science. It looks like watching. It looks like sitting with people and having a conversation. Most of what we're doing in this phase is trying to understand, the details, the specifics of our customers, the work they do, and what problems they have, what unmet needs they have. And so this involves a lot of market research, um, interviewing individual users, and users, span from, the patient, a caregiver, the hospital that's trying to manage all of this, even up to insurance companies who are deciding, how to best pay for the patient's care. So all of this is market research, and these are all conversations that we're having, interviews, observation, etc. Once we've developed that understanding of the customer's needs, then we spend a lot of time in brainstorming or technology assessments, either trying to come up with a new solution on our own, a new product idea on our own, or finding other technologies. For example, technologies that have solved a similar problem in a different industry. A lot of, a key topic in healthcare right now is telemedicine. How can healthcare providers take care of a patient who's in another location? And we look at other industries. How have other industries remotely, worked together? And so we, have spent a lot of time with, looking at technologies from collaboration, very similar to the kind of teleconferencing that we're doing right here. But we've looked at technologies from military applications, from broadcast applications, from radio applications. And so it's understanding the world, understanding how those technologies have developed, and understanding how they might meet these customer needs. Just going to take a pause quickly to look at the Q&A. I'll take one of these questions now. Question is, what are some good ways to do large-scale market research, and are there any ways to automate similar answers? Some of the best tools for large-scale market research are, as you can imagine, online, and probably the easiest way to do those is online surveys. But a technique that we've found useful in doing large-scale market research is to create communities, kind of like a wiki group or an online focus group, where we create a website, we invite people who are interested in the question to join, and we kind of run a community for a period of weeks. We share information with them. We have deadlines where we're going to share different concepts with them. We get their reactions kind of real time as we share information. We have the ability to show prototypes or concepts and get real-time reaction. So they range from the traditional, different versions of surveys, but kind of the more interesting way right now is to do these online focus groups or communities that, run more than a day, that let people join, go back to their day job, come back, and be part of a community that's thinking about the problem with us over a couple of weeks. So going on to the next topic, I'll come to there's another question about pitching ideas. I'll come back to that at the end because that's a good question as well. So the second part of the new product development process is this imagining period. Um, it's going from kind of, a very high level idea of what kind of category of product you want to work on, maybe the broad strokes of a solution, to focusing in on what do we actually want to design. So your key questions here are questions like, what are the most important features? As you can imagine, the focus groups that we were talking about on the last slide, a lot of people have a lot of needs and they have a lot of great ideas. This would make my job easier. Um, but as you can imagine, you can't do everything, and you need to focus and make trade-offs so that you have kind of the optimal combination of a product that solves the most important needs, that is simple enough so that it can be used correctly and consistently, and that isn't too expensive or complicated. So answering that question of what are the most important features is probably your most important question at this stage. You're also asking, how would you make it? What kind of technologies are you going to use to do this? And then this is kind of an odd question, but at this point, all we're asking is, will it probably work? There's a lot of detail that you'll see in maybe the next slide where you can think about as we actually develop a product, because that's a process of years. And projects can fail right in the middle um, as you're refining the design, as you're going from an idea to a concept to a final product. Um, things don't work sometimes the way you expect them to. You hope you get there as soon as possible, but there are times when you've you know, taken a wrong turn. And so at this point, all we're trying to find out is, will it probably work? The next step is where we figure out, does it actually work and work every time? So the key activities here, it's starting to look more like engineering. This is, research in the technology fields, invention, actually coming up with ideas that are new and new ways to solve the problem, and prototyping. We're often using 3D printers in this phase, or rough prototyping of a concept to to see if some of our key technical risks are going to be a problem, or whether the concept will work as we've envisioned it in our minds. Um, Interesting development, maybe over the last 20 years. A lot of this prototyping is um, is in computers now, whereas we used to manufacture a lot more products, a lot more hard pieces, uh, to make sure that it worked, to make sure that all the system components are going to work together. A lot of this is done in computer simulations now. So that's been kind of an interesting development over the last 10, 15 years. Going to the next, oh, and I don't see how people are answering the polls or if anybody is answering the polls. But the first question was, on average, how long does it take to develop uh, the first one was about the Uber ride. How long did it take to go from the idea of an Uber ride to the first request for a ride? That was a 17-month process. So that seems quick to me because I come from the medical device world. It might seem long for people who are typically working in the computer area, but as you can imagine, all the moving pieces that are necessary to connect people into that Uber infrastructure, to hire people or contract with drivers, to advertise, etc. Um, Relatively quick, going from that idea to a solution in 17 months. The second question is, asking about specifically the medical device industry and how long it takes to develop a new medical product. So the possible answers there are less than a year, 1 to 2 years, 3 to 4 years, 5 to 7 years, or more than 7 years. We'll come back to answer that question here in a little bit. But on to the next phase of the new product development process, design. And this is where it actually looks like engineering. This is where we're deciding exactly what we want to build. Where you're defining exactly what materials you're using, what tolerances you're using. As on the software side, you're talking about what language are we going to be working in. Is this going to be a cloud or an edge solution? Making all of those very detailed, specific design questions. What we're typically calling this, where we're in CAD or we're actually coding, this is the detailed design process and the modeling process, where we're taking initial builds of our initial design just to make sure that it works as intended. And that modeling can happen just as easily in on the computer as it can in real life. We're doing testing on called finite element analysis or other testing methods that let us test not only that it works, but that it will work over time, that it would work in a knee joint, for example, if the patient lives another 70 years and if they walk an average of 25,000 steps a day, we still want to make sure that the product is going to work as intended for as long as it's needed. So that's kind of this stage of the new product development process. Design, it's the most specific, the most resembling kind of what you would imagine engineering looks like. The fourth phase is the testing process. And this is where the team actually expands quite a bit to include other people. If you can imagine, if you've written a paper, for example, how helpful it is to have somebody else proofread your work. The idea here is similar. You, Typically, the new product development team, you've been working with a core team that's working to solve this problem. And by the end of that design process, they think they've designed a product that meets the customer's needs and that is going to work over time in the real world, and that it can be manufactured quickly and easily and repeatably. Um, Now we expand the team to people who test those products and test some of those assumptions. Uh, our key questions here, we want to make sure it works and works every time and in every situation that we could imagine it being used in. And then we also want to make sure that it actually meets our customers' needs, because as you can imagine, we can imagine that we understand the customer. And just flipping back a couple of slides, we've spent days, weeks, sometimes months with these customers trying to understand their problems. But all we can do is watch and learn, and finding out whether we've understood their needs correctly, whether this is actually going to solve their problem, means going back to the customers, to the end users, and working with them to see if this works as intended, if this is going to solve their needs, if this is going to be useful in the real world. And so here we're doing two different kinds of tests. The first is internal testing, or what I refer to here as lab testing. If it's a physical component that imagine a screen on intravenous fluid pump. And just as simple as knowing that this button is going to be pushed 20 times a day over the next 5 years. That's the useful life of that product. We've built something in a lab that's going to push that button that many times, just pushing it repeatedly for days or weeks to make sure that it doesn't break, that nothing in that system is so fragile that it's going to break um, within the useful life of that product. So a lot of that lab testing, making sure that we're correctly defining the product, designing the product, sourcing the components to the product so that it's going to work as we designed it. That process, it depends on how long the product might be used in the real world. Sometimes lab testing to make sure that something satisfies its useful life. That test could run for 6 months just because the product has such a long useful life. We'll often be doing these different testing activities at the same time because they're kind of testing different assumptions. Whether this button is going to last over time will be one question, but then the bottom two are the more out into the real world, working with customers questions, showing them the final design, showing them the first versions of the product, and letting them use it either in a controlled environment or if we're running a clinical study, going through all of the permissions and taking a product out into the clinical environment and letting them use it with patients and making sure that it works there. So we can either have user feedback where they use a product and say, yes, this will or won't meet my needs as a clinician, or letting them use it in the real world and saying, I've used this with patients for the last 3 months, and these are the challenges that I had, these are the things that worked well. And we're still open to the opportunity to redesign the product at this phase, to make any corrections, to make any improvements, to optimize the design. And I'll come back to the question of how long each of these phases take and the overall length of the process here as we get to the next slide. So I maybe answered this question a little bit. If something in testing goes wrong, is the question, do you restart or revise? And it really depends on what kind of failure you have. Is it just a fundamental problem that we didn't anticipate something that happens in the real world and that's going to make our solution fail? For example, from another industry, they were developing a solution for use in a surgery, and they just frankly were not aware of some of the developments in imaging technologies that were happening at the same time as they were developing their solution. They didn't know that a specific kind of X-ray called CT, or computer tomography, was being used more frequently during a surgery, and their solution failed if CT was used while their solution was on the operating room table. And so there they had to go back to a blank page and come up with a new solution because their testing just proved that it would not work in a real world environment. You hope that those don't happen frequently, but you will find revision at this phase. You'll find that you've made some assumptions in your code around how you're managing memory, or lag times that you're experiencing in the network in the hospital. And so hopefully here, sometimes it can take an extended period to overcome this challenge, but hopefully you're able to revise and don't have to restart the whole process. So going on to the fifth part of the new product development process is making the product. And this is where, again, you're expanding the team, including not only people from the manufacturing or the production part of the organization, but the actual production line. You'll hear the picture on the upper left-hand corner. You will create a manufacturing line that looks just like the one that you will have in the plant, and you will start you know, building the equipment or using the equipment that is assembling the products, that's stamping steel, that's molding plastic, etc. You're using the actual people who are going to be assembling components. And here it's really kind of another phase of that testing process, but we want to actually start making the product and then make sure that the process that we've developed for making it um, works every time, that we can make it quickly and correctly, that it works exactly the way we designed it, and that we can make as many as we need, that the process works when we you know, speed up the assembly line and we're making 1,000 of these a day instead of 10 a day. And so the key activities, as I lay out here, you've got pilot manufacturing, where you've got a pilot assembly line where you're just making a few, volume manufacturing where you're increasing the volume, and then product launch where you kind of turn the key and you're now sending these products out the door, out to real customers. So let me go back to that second question. So that second question from the poll on it was, on average, how long does it take to develop a new medical product? And the answer is that on average, it takes 5 to 7 years to go from an idea for a medical device to actually launching that medical device. There are some that are shorter, there are some that are much longer. But the fact that it takes so long to develop a medical device kind of shows why it's so important to get those initial steps right. Because just going through those initial steps, as you can imagine, this understanding phase takes as long as you need it to take. And some companies and some people might be tempted to make this very short because we're not doing actual engineering until we're done here. But when you're working on a product for 5 to 7 years, you need to make sure that you've started correctly, that you've understood the customer needs, and that the work you're going to do for the next 4, 5, 6 years is going to, at the end of the day, solve a problem. So this understanding phase may take from 6 months to 2 years in my experience. The imagination phase is relatively brief. Some of this will be happening at the same time as the understanding phase, especially around understanding the technologies and doing that research. This is often in the 6 month to 1 year phase. Design can be very lengthy, and I described the engineering or the design team. A design team on a really complicated product, the most complicated product I could imagine was a new airplane, like the Boeing 777. That took a team of over 5,000 people, 240 different design teams working on components of that. And so this is probably the most extended period of the design process, or of the new product development process. Testing takes as long as it takes, depending on the useful life of the product and the different test methods you need. And then manufacturing is a relatively quick process. So my last poll of the day and my last slide is around advances in technology. And 5 to 7 years seems like a long time to develop a product from the idea to the concept. And one of the recent projects I was working with was around computer surgery. So it was interesting to look at this movie. This is a movie in the Alien series of movies. This was Prometheus back in 2012. And they were describing computerized surgery or robotic surgery as they could imagine it in the late 21st century, that surgery could be done on a spaceship where you didn't have a surgeon. Um, and so the poll question was, how long have we been talking about robots in general? The survey is, you know, when was the word robot introduced? Before 1940, in the 40s, 50s, 60s, 70s, 80s, or after the 80s? And maybe the surprising fact is that we've been talking about robots for a long time. The term robot was invented in 1921. And this movie was describing how futuristic they imagined robotic surgery being. But this is robotic surgery, and this is very similar to what was described in that science fiction movie. And this is a surgical robotic system that was launched in 2019. So I think new product development is both overwhelming and encouraging. It's overwhelming to think that you're going to work on one project for 5 to 7 years, or to think that people have been talking about the technology you're working on, robots, for over 100 years. But it's also heartening to know that it's possible to develop something that is, you know, looks like what people imagine technology to be 100 years from now. So I'll look through the Q&A, or Erica, if you have any other questions or chat that you want to highlight to me. The question about the COVID vaccine is really interesting, because on the one hand, the need for a COVID vaccine, for a vaccine that would address that specific need, was over a period of months. We discovered that we needed a COVID vaccine, what was it, 18, 20 months ago. And, we were able to have a vaccine on the market roughly 12 months later, I think it was. But the interesting thing is that the core technology for the COVID vaccine had been in development for, I think, the last 15 years. The specific way of developing a vaccine using recombinant, was it MRSA or RSA? That technique, people had been thinking about for decades, and had been planning and thinking about how to make a vaccine using that technique for over a decade. And so on the one hand, it was something that they could do within a year, but on the other hand, they were only able to do it for a year because they'd been thinking about it for 10 years. They'd just been laying all the pieces in place to launch it, which is actually how a lot of science and a lot of engineering and a lot of innovation works. I've been an inventor of a lot of patents, and almost nothing I'm patenting is coming from nowhere. I'm taking work that other people have done, other inventions, and combining them in novel ways. But really, that's all I'm doing, is I'm combining things that already exist in a way that somebody didn't imagine before. It's a lot like writing, that we're all using the same words, or composing. We're all using the same notes. We're just organizing them in different interesting ways. So let's see. I think I a little bit answered this question. How long does testing take from lab testing to real world experience? We'll often be doing them at the same time. If you're talking about meeting a customer's needs, does this solution meet your need? Going into an actual clinical trial can take much longer. If you're talking about a product that is a highly regulated product that will have to go through a regulatory process before it can ever be used on a patient, that kind of lab testing will often take us 12, 18 months. But then the process for being allowed to run a clinical trial may take up to a year, and then a clinical trial will often take 2 to 3 years to go through the whole process of collecting, getting people enrolled in the study, using the intervention, and then analyzing the results. Again, back to the question about the COVID vaccine, it does, make it a little overwhelming to think how quickly they went through those clinical trials. Probably the biggest difference is that in pharmaceuticals, there's a well-established process for running clinical trials of vaccines and for other pharmaceuticals, and so that made it a little less challenging than the area I work in, which is medical devices, which are every time a little more different. So I think we're coming up on the deadline. Let me see if there are anything pinned on the chat. I don't think so. So Erica, unless you've got anything else, let me check over here. I think we're good. Okay. Thank you all. Have a great day. Have great sessions.